Picture this. It's a freezing Monday morning in Moscow. The halls of the Central Bank of Russia are dead silent. Not the calm silence of confidence, the suffocating silence of panic. Behind closed doors, Elvira Nabulina, the head of Russia's central bank, is staring at a screen filled with numbers that no longer make sense. The ruble is sliding, inflation is clawing upward like a fever that won't break, and the interest rate, already jacked to a staggering 21%, is doing nothing, absolutely nothing. Across the city, factory owners are making phone calls they never imagined making, not to suppliers, not to clients, and eventually to bankruptcy lawyers Dukshen. In the shipyards of St. Petersburg, half-finished hulls sit rusting because the parts, the foreign-made precision components, simply don't exist anymore. In the tech corridors of Skolkovo, Russia's answer to Silicon Valley, office after office sits dark. The engineers are gone. Berlin, Dubai, Tbilisi, they're not coming back. And in the Kremlin itself, behind the gold-trimmed walls, where power has been performed like theater for over 2 decades, a new emotion is creeping into the briefing rooms. Not anger, not defiance, something Vladimir Putin's inner circle has almost never allowed themselves to feel: doubt. This is not a recession, this is not a dip. What is unfolding inside Russia's economy right now is something far more structural, far more irreversible, and far more dangerous than anything Western sanctions alone could have caused. Because the truth, the one Moscow will never say out loud, is that Russia's economy has just hit a wall. And this wall wasn't built by Washington, it wasn't built by Brussels. It was built by the Kremlin itself, brick by brick, ruble by ruble, decision by catastrophic decision, and there is no going back. Shuen. For years, the world bought the narrative. Russia is a fortress economy. Russia is sanction-proof. Shuen. Russia pivoted to China and survived. Bloomberg ran the headlines. CNN repeated them. Even some Western defense analysts shrugged and admitted, Moscow found a way. Shuen. But here's what none of those headlines told you. The survival was a performance, a meticulously staged illusion held together by 3 fragile pillars. Yuan. Record-high energy prices, a wartime spending spree funded by sovereign wealth reserves. Yuan. And brutal capital controls that trapped money inside the country like prisoners in a cell. And now, in the first half of 2025, all 3 pillars are cracking at the same time. Shuen. Let's start with the one that matters most. Oil. Russia's federal budget depends on energy revenues for roughly 40% of its income. 40% Dutch yuan. That's not an economy, that's a gas station with a flag. And for a while, it worked. Shuen. After the initial shock of Western sanctions in 2022, Moscow rerouted its crude to India, China, Turkey, Shuen, and a web of shadow buyers using a ghost fleet of aging tankers with murky insurance and falsified manifests. Shuen. Prices stayed high, revenue kept flowing, the Kremlin exhaled. Shuen. But that window is slamming shut. The global oil market has shifted. Shuen. OPEC Plus is fracturing internally, with Saudi Arabia signaling it's willing to flood the market to reclaim share. Shuen. Brent crude has dipped below $72 a barrel, well under Russia's budgetary break-even point. Shuen, which most analysts at the International Monetary Fund now peg between $85 and $90. Shuen. Every single dollar below that line is a hole in Russia's budget. Shuen. And right now, that hole is growing by roughly $300 million every single week. Shuen. Moreover, the Shadow Fleet, that ingenious sanctions evasion armada, is dying. Not from military strikes, from physics. Shuen. These tankers are old. Some are over 20 years past their expected service life. Shuen. Insurance companies in Hong Kong and Dubai are quietly pulling coverage. Shuen. Port authorities in India, once Russia's most willing buyer, are turning ships away. Shuen. After a string of catastrophic spills in the Baltic and the waters off Denmark. Shuen. The EU's 14th sanctions package specifically targeted the logistics backbone of this fleet, Shuen, blacklisting dozens of vessels and the shell companies that own them. Shuen. But while the world watched oil prices, something far more dangerous was happening inside Russia's own financial system. A slow-motion implosion that no amount of propaganda can hide. Shuen. The interest rate, 21%, let that satisfactorily sink in. Shuen. In any normal economy, a rate that high is an emergency brake, a last resort tool used to crush inflation by making borrowing almost impossibly expensive. And Shuen. And Nabulina pulled that lever hard, but here's the paradox that's now eating Russia alive from the inside. Yuan. The rate isn't stopping inflation. Consumer prices in Russia rose by over 9% year-on-year as of March 2025, according to Rosstat, Russia's own statistical agency, Yuan. Independent estimates from analysts at Yale's Chief Executive Leadership Institute put the real figure closer to 15% yuan. When accounting for the goods ordinary Russians actually buy, food, medicine, clothing, eggs, yuan. The price of eggs in Russia became a national scandal last winter, and it hasn't gone away. Gwen. But the 21% rate is doing something else, something devastating. It's strangling every civilian business that isn't directly connected to the war machine. Yuan. Small and medium enterprises, the bakeries, the logistics firms, the software startups cannot borrow, they cannot invest, they cannot grow, they are being financially suffocated yuan, while military contractors gorge on government spending at preferential rates. This is not an accident. This is the architecture of a war economy. Yuan. This is not an accident. This is the architecture of a war economy. Yuan. And war economies have one fatal flaw. They only work as long as the war delivers results. The moment the war stalls, the economic engine doesn't slow down. It collapses because there's nothing underneath it. Yuan. And the war has stalled. Amanda, this is the part Moscow doesn't want you to connect. The grinding, attritional nature of the front lines in Ukraine isn't just a military problem. It's an economic time bomb. Yuan. Russia is now spending close to 40% of its entire federal budget on defense and national security. 40% yuan. To put that in perspective, the Soviet Union, at the peak of its Cold War military insanity, was spending roughly the same proportion right before it economically disintegrated. Yuan. The Russian government approved a 2025 federal budget of approximately 37 trillion rubles. Yuan. Of that, a record 13.5 trillion is allocated to what Moscow classifies as national defense and security. Yuan. That's more than education, healthcare, infrastructure, and social services combined. Yuan. According to analysis from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, Russia's real military expenditure now exceeds 6.5% of GDP yuan, making it proportionally one of the highest in the world, higher than Israel, higher than Saudi Arabia, yuan. And unlike those countries, Russia doesn't have a diversified economy or sovereign wealth funds deep enough to absorb the shock. Yuan. Here's what that means on the ground. Russian factories that once produced refrigerators, washing machines, and civilian vehicles have been quietly, and sometimes forcibly, converted to produce artillery shells, drone components, and armored vehicle parts. Yuan. The Ural wagon factory in Nizhny Tagil, once a symbol of Soviet industrial might, is running triple shifts producing T-90 tanks and repairing damaged armor pulled back from the front. Yuan. Workers are being offered salaries 3 to 4 times the regional average. Yuan. Sounds great, until you realize that money floods into a local economy where there's nothing to buy. Yuan. The stores are thin, the imports are gone, and every ruble those workers earn pushes prices higher for everyone around them. Yuan. This is textbook wartime inflation, not the kind caused by supply chain hiccups, but the kind caused by a government printing money and pouring it into destruction rather than production. Gwen. Guns instead of butter. It's the oldest economic trap in history, and Russia just walked straight into it. Yuan. But the real shock was what happened to the people who were supposed to build Russia's future. The brain drain. This is the wound that doesn't bleed on camera, but it's the one that will take a generation to heal. If it ever does. Kwan. Since February 2022, conservative estimates suggest that between 700,000 and 1 million Russians have left the country. Yuan. These aren't random departures. These are the engineers, the programmers, the doctors, the entrepreneurs, the human capital that any modern economy needs to function. Yuan. The Russian Association of Electronic Communications reported that the IT sector alone lost over 100,000 professionals in the first year of the war. Yuan. Many went to Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Turkey, countries that don't require visas for Russian citizens. Yuan. But increasingly, they're moving further. Germany, the Netherlands, Canada, Yuan. And they're settling in, they're buying apartments, enrolling their children in schools, they are not coming back. Xuan. Kremlin officials have tried everything. Tax breaks, draft exemptions, patriotic guilt campaigns. None of it is working. Xuan. Because the people who left aren't just fleeing the war, they're fleeing the system. Xuan. They looked at a country that chose tanks over technology, obedience over innovation, and they made the rational calculation. Xuan. There is no future here. Xuan. Now, let's talk about what's happening to ordinary Russians, because this is where geopolitics stops being abstract and starts being human. The Russian middle class is evaporating, not slowly, not gradually, rapidly. Xuan. According to data from Russia's own Higher School of Economics, one of the few institutions still publishing semi-independent research, real disposable incomes for the median Russian household have fallen by approximately 12% since 2022 when adjusted for actual consumer inflation rather than the doctored government figures. Xuan. Housing costs in Moscow and St. Petersburg have surged as the construction sector struggles with both labor shortages and the vanishing of imported building materials. Xuan. Mortgage rates, tied to the central bank's benchmark, have made home ownership a fantasy for anyone under 40 who doesn't already own property. A standard mortgage in Russia now carries an interest rate above 20%. Xuan. 20%. In the United States, a rate half that high triggered a housing crisis. In Russia, it's simply the new normal, a normal that is quietly crushing the aspirations of an entire generation. Xuan. Healthcare is deteriorating. The departure of Western pharmaceutical companies hasn't been fully offset by Indian and Chinese generics. Cancer patients report waiting months for medications that were once available in days. Xuan. Medical equipment, MRI machines, CT scanners, surgical instruments, is aging without replacement parts. Russian hospitals are cannibalizing old machines to keep others running. This isn't a healthcare system, it's a triage operation. Xuan. And education, the one investment that could theoretically rebuild Russia's future, is hemorrhaging funding. University budgets have been slashed to redirect money toward the military. Xuan. Research programs in fundamental science, technology, and engineering are being defunded or repurposed for defense applications. The message to young Russian academics is unmistakable. Your value to the state is measured in your usefulness to the war. Nothing else matters. Xuan. But while the president spoke of national resilience and a strong sovereign economy, his closest economic advisors were already sounding alarms behind closed doors that paint a very different picture. Xuan. Leaked minutes from a restricted session of the Russian Security Council's Economic Working Group, reported by the independent outlet The Insider in March 2025, revealed a blunt internal assessment. Xuan. Russia's National Welfare Fund, the sovereign piggy bank that has been financing the budget deficit, will be functionally depleted by late 2026 at current drawdown rates. Xuan. When that fund hits zero, Russia faces a binary choice: print money and unleash hyperinflation, or cut spending and face social unrest. There is no third option. There is no hidden reserve. There is no Chinese bailout coming. The math is the math, and the math is terminal. Xuan. Every authoritarian regime in history has survived on an unspoken deal between the ruler and the ruled. The terms in Russia have been remarkably consistent for 25 years. Xuan. And for a long time, Putin delivered. From the chaos of the 1990s, the oligarch wars, the collapsing ruble, the empty shelves, he built something that felt like order. Xuan. But that contract is now breaking. Not in the dramatic revolutionary way that Western commentators fantasize about. Russians aren't going to storm the Kremlin. That's not how this works. Xuan. It's the mother in Kazan who lost her son near Avdiivka and receives a payment from the state, 3 million rubles, roughly $30,000, and realizes that her government has literally priced her child's life. Xuan. It's the small business owner in Krasnodar who played by every rule, paid every tax, built something real, and watched it evaporate because the central bank made borrowing impossible to fund a war he never asked for. Xuan. These people aren't dissidents. They're not protesters. They're simply disengaged. And in an authoritarian system, mass disengagement is more dangerous than mass protest. Xuan. There were only a few months left before the next critical fiscal deadline, and inside the Kremlin, the clock was already deafening. Yuan. The Russian federal budget for 2025 was built on assumptions that have already collapsed. It assumed an average oil price of roughly $85 per barrel. Brent is trading below 72 yuan. It assumed that inflation would be tamed by the central bank's rate hikes. Inflation is accelerating, and it assumed, perhaps most fatally, that the war would either be won or frozen by now, allowing a gradual reduction in military spending. Yuan. The war is neither won nor frozen. It grinds on, and every month it continues. It devours resources that Russia does not have and cannot replace. This is not speculation. This is arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't care about propaganda. Yuan. So where does this go? There are 3 realistic scenarios unfolding from this point, and none of them are comfortable for Moscow. Yuan. The first scenario is managed decline. In this path, the Kremlin acknowledges, internally, never publicly, that the current trajectory is unsustainable. Military spending is quietly capped. Yuan. Living standards erode slowly rather than catastrophically. Yuan. Russia becomes a larger version of Iran, sanctioned, isolated, functional, but diminished. A power that once shaped the global order, reduced to managing its own decay. Yuan. The second scenario is accelerated fragmentation. In this path, the Kremlin doubles down. Military spending increases further. The National Welfare Fund is drained to zero. Yuan. Regional governors, especially in resource-rich areas like Tatarstan, Yakutia, and Chelyabinsk, begin quietly retaining local tax revenue rather than sending it to Moscow. Yuan. This doesn't mean Russia breaks apart tomorrow, but it means the central government's ability to project power, internally, begins to degrade. Yuan. Survival through repression rather than performance. Russia doesn't collapse, it fossilizes. The third scenario is the most dangerous, external escalation as internal distraction. Yuan. Argentina did it with the Falklands. Saddam Hussein did it with Kuwait. The pattern is ancient and it is reliable. In this scenario, the Kremlin, facing a depleted treasury, a restless population, and a war that has delivered neither victory nor peace, escalates. Yuan. Perhaps in the Arctic, where Russian and NATO interests over energy resources and shipping lanes are already colliding. Perhaps through a dramatic cyber operation against Western financial infrastructure. Yuan. And the fact that it is even on the table tells you everything about how desperate the internal situation has become. When the math turns terminal, desperate leaders don't reach for calculators. They reach for missiles. Yuan. In 1998, when the ruble collapsed and Russia defaulted on its debt, the country still had options. Yuan. In 2025, none of those conditions exist. The energy reserves are still there, but the customers are leaving. The educated population is emigrating. Yuan. NATO has expanded to include Finland and Sweden, adding over 800 miles of new border with Russia. The global semiconductor supply chain has been deliberately rewired to exclude Russian access. Yuan. Moreover, the demographic crisis underneath all of this makes recovery almost mathematically impossible on any reasonable timeline. Russia's population is shrinking. The birth rate has fallen to its lowest level since the late Soviet period. Yuan. The UN Population Division projects that Russia will lose nearly 12 million people by 2050, dropping from approximately 144 million to 133 million. Yuan. You cannot run a continental-sized economy with a shrinking, aging, emigrating population. You cannot innovate without young engineers. You cannot produce without factory workers. You cannot fight without soldiers. Yuan. Amanda, this is the part where we step back and see the full picture. Not the one Moscow paints, not the one Western hawks exaggerate. The real one. Russia is not about to vanish. It's not going to shatter like glass. Yuan. It will endure. But endurance is not strength. Endurance is what happens when strength is gone, and all that's left is the refusal to admit it. Yuan. The Soviet Union endured for years after its economy became a hollow shell. It endured through repression, through propaganda, through sheer institutional inertia. Yuan. The system simply stopped being believed in, by the people, by the elites, by the very institutions that were supposed to defend it, and it folded. Quietly, Yuan. Almost politely, like a house of cards in a room where someone finally opened a window. Xuan. The wall that Russia has hit is not made of sanctions. It's not made of oil prices. It's not made of interest rates. It's made of choices. Gwen. 25 years of choices that prioritize control over competitiveness, loyalty over talent, and empire over economy. Gwen. The world is not waiting for Russia to recover. The world has moved on, and the sound you hear, beneath the propaganda, beneath the parade footage, beneath the triumphant headlines on state television, is not strength. It's the deep, structural groan of an economy that has consumed its own future, and futures once consumed do not grow back. The Russian economy didn't hit this wall by accident. It was driven into it, at full speed, with the headlights off. And now, in the silence that follows the impact, the only question left is not whether the damage can be repaired. It's whether anyone inside the Kremlin has the courage to even look at the wreck. So far, the answer is no. Xuan.